Sure. So thanks everyone for being with us this afternoon. This is the fourth webinar in our Race Results series, which we've developed to prepare you all for the upcoming Race for Results report, which will be released on October 24th. If you were unable to attend the three webinars we did before this one on demographics and laying that groundwork to give you all an idea of the population that we're talking about, another one on stakeholder engagement, and the third one on framing. If you haven't been able to attend those, you can find recordings of them on KidsNet. We will have our final webinar of this series on October 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and this webinar will focus on policy impacting children and immigrant families. Now, with us today, we have Mark Mather, who's the Vice President of Domestic Programs at the Population Reference Bureau, and Zhana Badalova, who's the Senior Policy Analyst and the Data Hub Manager at the Migration Policy Institute. Mark will provide a little bit of background on how we define children and immigrant families in the Race for Results report, as well as how we measure their well-being in Race for Results. And then Jana will describe data sources that you all can use to obtain data on children and immigrant families. Now with that, I'd love to welcome Jana and Mark to this webinar, and thank you both for taking the time, and I'll pass it on to Mark.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks for the introduction. I'm actually the Associate Vice President for U.S. Programs, but I appreciate the promotion, Flo.
You're welcome.
And I want to thank the Annie Casey Foundation for providing support for these webinars, and especially Flo and Paulani for helping to set this up. As Flo mentioned, I'm going to provide some background on data on children and immigrant families. And my part of the presentation, I'm really going to provide sort of some big picture information. At PRB, we mostly focus on data from the Census Bureau, so I'm going to mainly focus on those data, whereas Jana is going to provide more details about other sources of data. There's lots of other great sources out there from the Federal Statistical System on immigrant kids, so she'll cover some of that. So here are the four things I'm going to briefly cover here. So first, why should we focus on children and immigrant families? Why is this an important topic? I think many of you already know that, but it's important to remind ourselves why we should focus on this subgroup. I'll talk about some definitions, how PRB is defining this group, who are children and immigrant families and where do they live. So I can't give a presentation without providing some colorful charts and maps, so I will be, just to give everyone some background, I'll provide some of that contextual information. And then Flo mentioned the upcoming Race for Results report, so I'll talk a little bit about how we measure the well-being of children and immigrant families, and specifically I'll be saying a few words about how we're measuring these outcomes in the upcoming Race for Results report. So from a demographic perspective, I am a demographer, so when we're talking here about kids and immigrant families, we're interested in what's happening with the population and labor force. And kids and immigrant families really are the driving force today in the United States in terms of what's currently driving growth of the U.S. population, the labor force, and in the future, it's really going to be the driving force in the economy as all of these young people reach adulthood and start to enter the workforce. They're also leading a racial ethnic shift in the U.S. population and labor force, so I'll provide a slide or two about that. And then obviously they have unique policy and programmatic needs. So right now DACA is obviously the big issue that everyone's talking about, but as shown in the Race for Results report, it's not the only issue. There are millions of immigrant families and children with lots of important issues that need to be addressed. So we'll talk about some of those in the upcoming report. Here are some of the basic numbers. And you can see that back in 1990, there were about 8.3 million children of immigrant families in the U.S. That was about 13% of all kids under age 18 who were living in immigrant families. By 2015, that number had more than doubled to 18.3 million kids. So that there's been a rapid increase in children in immigrant families and similar increase in the share of the population in immigrant families. So as of today, it's about 1/4 of all kids who we classify as living in immigrant families. What's driving this is primarily historical trends in immigration, especially from Latin America, but also increasingly from Asia. And so what has happened with immigration, you tend to attract a lot of young people of reproductive age, and that creates a situation demographers call population momentum. So you've got lots of young people who are starting families, and therefore lots of children in those families, children who are first or second generation. And that's really what's been driving population growth in the United States for several decades. It's what's kind of separated the United States from many other developed countries that are growing much more slowly. As a result of those trends, we've seen pretty dramatic changes in the racial ethnic composition in the U.S. population, and it's really been happening from the bottom up. So you see it first among kids. And it's actually created kind of a racial ethnic gap across generations where we've got all of this diversity we're seeing among young people, and then you can compare that with baby boomers and older adults, most of whom are still non-Hispanic white. And so if you look at the makeup of Congress, for example, mostly older white men, and it really is a stark contrast to what's happening with young people, and I think that is one of the policy challenges that we're facing. In terms of the numbers, the green bars here in this chart represent the data for Hispanic Latino youth, and you can see the rapid increase from 1980 to 2015 from 9% of the population of kids to 25%. And so it's expected that in the next few years, before 2020, the share of racial ethnic minorities will exceed 50% of the child population, so they'll reach that so-called majority minority status by 2020 for the child population. But also among immigrant children, there's a great deal of diversity. So this pie chart shows that the breakdown of children in immigrant families by race ethnicity. And so it's over half on the left-hand side there. You can see our Hispanic Latino, but also 17% are Asian American. And we've got a growing share, 8% currently, who are Black or African American, reflecting the growing levels of immigration to the United States from Africa and the Caribbean. We've also got 5% who are in this other category, multiracial children, and that group is growing as well. And to give you a sense of the diversity and why it matters in terms of policy, this is a chart I just pulled together for 2015 showing child poverty rates by immigrant status and broken down for different racial ethnic groups. So the blue bars here represent kids in immigrant families. The orange bars represent children in U.S.-born families, and we can compare the child poverty rates across different racial ethnic groups. So you can see overall, for the total population, total kids, kids in immigrant families are more likely to be poor than those in U.S.-born families. It's not true for all of the racial ethnic groups, however. So if you look at the data for Black African American youth, poverty rates are much higher for children in U.S.-born families. They're also high for Asian American children born in the U.S., and as also those in this other and multiracial category. And then here's a chart I'm sure you've seen before. I pulled this right out of the Kids Count Data Center to show the states where we see the highest shares of children in immigrant families. It's California, Nevada, It's Texas, Florida, New York, and New Jersey, those shaded in red there. We see much lower shares in the places you'd expect, kind of in upper Midwest, parts of Appalachia, the Deep South, and in parts of the Northeast. Interestingly, I looked at trends over time as well, from 2000 to the present, to see how these shares have changed, and there was only one state where the share of immigrant kids declined between 2000 and 2015, and that was Arizona. So those are some of the key patterns and trends. Now I want to talk a little bit about definitions and sources. So this is how PRB defines kids in immigrant families, and this is based on data we're using from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. It's children under age 18 who are themselves foreign-born or who live with at least one foreign-born parent. And when we use this term foreign-born, these are foreign-born include those who are non-citizens of the U.S. or who are U.S. citizens by naturalization. So the native-born population includes those who were born in the U.S., born in Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, or other U.S. territories. For those who really want to get into the details, these are the 7 categories of children that we identify with ACS data based on whether the child was born in the U.S., their family structure, so are they in a married couple or single parent family, and then looking at their parental nativity status. So of these 7 categories, there are 5 groups of kids that are classified as living in immigrant families. So those are the ones where the child was born outside of the U.S., or for kids in married couple families, if one or both of the parents was born outside of the U.S., or in the case of kids in single parent families, that the parent is foreign born. And Jana is going to provide some additional information about how you can get to these data without having to go through all of these detailed classifications, because there are published tables that will get you close to what I'm showing here. So I mentioned that we use the ACS to get these data, and the primary benefit of the ACS is the large sample, so it provides access to reliable data for many states and large population subgroups. And so immigrant kids were able to not only produce some state-level estimates for children in immigrant families, but we can also produce some cross-tabulations of well-being for those kids in immigrant families. So at the state level, the ACS is really the only source of data where we'd be able to produce those kinds of detailed cross-tabulations. The ACS is also quite timely, so with the recent release, we now have access to 2016 one-year data from the ACS. The challenge is, at least in terms of the way that PRB is defining kids in immigrant families, we use data from the ACS public use microdata sample, which means you need access to statistical software to analyze that information. And the drawback of the public use sample, the PUMS, is that you don't get data for very small geographic areas because of confidentiality protections. Really, you're limited to state-level estimates or so-called public use microdata areas, or PUMAs, which tend to be a little bit more difficult to work with. And then the other challenge with the ACS is there's limited information about kids who are not living with parents or children in complex living arrangements. So one of the issues with the ACS is that you don't get pointers in the file that identify parent and child relationships. So you can identify parents easily if the parent is identified as the household reference person. It's a household-based sample, and they kind of define relationships based on that household reference person. But you don't get pointers that this child is related to this or that adult in the household. Whereas the CPS, the Current Population Survey, it's a much smaller sample, but it gives you more flexibility in getting those types of complex living arrangements. So if you go to the Child Trends website and look for kids in immigrant families based on the CPS, you'll likely find a larger number than what we're finding from the ACS because of the ability for them to look at those complex living arrangements. I want to say a few words now about the Race for Results report, since it's coming out in 2 or 3 weeks, I guess. I've been asked to provide a quick refresher about how we're creating the index for that report and the data we have on immigrant families in that report. So just as a reminder, the Race for Results report is providing state-level data for 12 indicators disaggregated by race ethnicity. We standardized the measures using a standard score method very similar to what we've always used for the Kids Count project, for the Kids Count data book. And then those standard scores are converted to a scale ranging from 0 to 1,000. We then average them to create a composite index for each state and for each racial ethnic group combination. So for example, you can see how African American kids in Mississippi are faring relative to African American kids in other states and how they're comparing with other racial ethnic groups in other states. And then higher scores indicate more positive outcomes for kids, and all of the measures are constructed in a way so that they're positive indicators and reflect kids at different stages of life from birth through young adulthood. So I know this is a lot of information for one slide, but I encourage you to look at the 2014 Race for Results report if you need a refresher about any of the methods used, because they're essentially unchanged for this year's report. These are the 12 indicators that are included, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see we start with young kids, babies born at normal birth weight, and we've got other indicators that go up to age young adults from 19 to 26. So it is a range of indicators reflecting different dimensions of child well-being. In the report, we're providing data, national data, for 10 of the 12 Race for Results measures. So there are 2 measures, that's on-time graduation and females who delay childbearing, for which data are not available for immigrant kids. And then we have to be a little bit creative for 3 of the other measures. So birth weight data we base on nativity status of the mother. English language learner status is used as a proxy for immigrant status for measures of math and reading proficiency. And then for the data for young adults, the 2 measures we have for young adults are just based on nativity status of that individual, not the parental nativity status. So we are not producing an index for children in immigrant families as we are for the racial ethnic groups. And part of that is because of the limitations in not having all of the indicators available. That's not to say that something couldn't be created at some point in the future where we compared index values for kids in immigrant families versus U.S.-born families, but it's not something that we tackled for this report. However, Jean D'Amico, my colleague at PRB, has been busy producing some additional estimates for you all to provide some additional, basically to provide some additional context. So she's producing cross-tabulations of child well-being for these different measures by race, ethnicity, by immigrant status, and by state. So I'll warn you in advance that this type of 3-way crosstab really pushes the limits of what the ACS can do. So there will be a lot of missing data. If you're looking for data for New York or California, you'll probably find a lot of useful information here, but for a lot of the smaller states and states that don't have a lot of children in immigrant families, there's going to be a lot of missing data. So we we suppress estimates if the coefficient of variation is greater than 30%, and there's going to be a lot of cases, I think, that will be suppressed in this file, but we hope that there will be some useful information that you can use to talk more about how these kids are doing. So I'm going to stop there to give Jana some time to talk more, but if you have any questions, if something comes to you after this webinar, feel free to contact either me or Jean D'Amico, who's been working on a lot of these data. We'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Flo and Mark, for inviting me to speak to your network. I'm excited to introduce all of you to the various data sources that are available about children of immigrants, and hopefully by the end of our presentations, you will feel more confident and comfortable not only finding the data, but also assessing the quality of the data and figuring out whether it's applicable, whether the data are good for the purposes of your inquiry, advocacy, and service providing. With immigration being in the news daily, with both real and fake facts and stats floating in what I call the nebulous field of policymaking, I believe it's more important than ever that the stakeholders like yourself, like us, understand what types of data are available, where to find them, and what questions to ask about how the data are collected, analyzed, and reported. And that's the goal of our presentations today. Thanks to technology, data have to some extent been democratized. Today we have near instant access to a wide variety of data points. But at the same time, without an experienced eye to ensure accurate and valid interpretation of statistical evidence, stakeholders can be also misled by sloppy or even intentionally misleading work. And that's why before we jump into looking at actual data sources, we should talk about the different populations so we understand the definitions, how they connect to each other, that may fall into the big category called what we call children of immigrants. And we also need to talk about data limitations. As my advisor in grad school liked to say, no data source is perfect, but some are definitely better than others. So that's something for us to keep in mind. And then there are different providers of data, and we'll talk about why we should use or rely on information coming from some data sources than from others. So without further ado, let's get to our first slide, definitions. So the universe of children from immigrant families, and thank you, Mark, for giving us a brief definition. The universe includes a number of groups, and there is some overlap, but they are not always the same populations. So when you see the terms children of immigrants, data and research that you might be reading might be talking about slightly different populations. So sometimes you will see that the data focus on children 0 to 17. That's one of the most common definitions. But then you will also see 0 to 18, so you can capture the last age group of people who are attending high school. For immigration benefits, for instance, in terms of immigration, what immigration law allows people for sponsorship of either parents or children, the 0 to 21 group is considered. And in the law, the immigration law, the 0 to 21 are considered to be children, as long as they are unmarried. And then for the definition of DACA, children are defined as those 0 to 15. All right, so let's keep an eye on how the age groups are defined. As Mark mentioned, the PRB and MPI and many others who use the Census Bureau data, we define children of immigrants as those who are either immigrants themselves, meaning that they were born with no U.S. citizenship, so they had no U.S. citizenship at birth, or they could be born in the United States with at least one immigrant parent. And the definition of immigrants includes naturalized citizens, green card holders, refugees, unauthorized, and some other small groups. So, which is also important. We often have a question when people look at our data on immigrants. They say, who are the people who are included? So now you know. You also might find that research talks about immigrant generation when they describe children of immigrants, and they will talk about first versus second immigrant generation. And the first generation refers to children who are immigrants themselves, so they were born abroad, and the second generation refers to U.S.-born children with at least one immigrant parent. Yet another definition sometimes used as a proxy for children of immigrants are the English language learners or English learners. And that's especially important when we look at the data on school children directly from schools. For the most part, because of the legislation stipulations, states do not track data on their students by nativity or child of immigrant status or by parental nativity, but they track data in terms of whether this child is considered to be an English learner, and that is based on the home language survey that is administered to every child at the time of enrollment. But often people use it as a proxy. It's not always a perfect proxy, but sometimes this is what we have. The next group is probably the most contentious of all immigrant groups is the unauthorized. MPI estimated that about 5 million children under the age of 18 reside in the so-called mixed status families. And that is, it's a family where at least one member is, primarily the parent, is the unauthorized. These 5 million children account for nearly a third of all children of immigrants and 7% of all children. Out of 5 million, about 1 million are unauthorized themselves. And then we have several subpopulations that fall into that umbrella group. We have unaccompanied minor children, unaccompanied alien children, which as an abbreviation you would see UACs as an abbreviation used everywhere, but this is what it means. And these are children under 18 who arrive at the border without a parent or legal guardian and have no permit to reside in the U.S. legally. They are treated differently from an adult unauthorized person who is apprehended at the border. Many of you know that the President Obama's program, DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, launched in 2012, shielded close to 700,000 from deportation, at least temporarily. But more than 200,000 were kids under 15, too young to apply under the conditions of this program. And so with the end of the program by the Trump administration, we can only hope that there will be a legislation such as a DREAM Act that will address their future. Another group that recently became a bitter point of contention is refugees. But we have other groups that fall under that term. Often the terms are used interchangeably, but they're not fully interchangeable. Asylum seekers and persons with temporary protected status, TPS. And then if you look at the data, we want to know about how people who came as refugees or asylum seekers are doing over time. Unfortunately, the available data is only covers refugees at arrival. So that's why you will see the difference between arrivals and people who were refugees at some point. So we have much more data on arrivals than on the other group. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is what I call data blues. We all have them as data analysts. We probably suffer from data blues more than anyone else. But it's important to keep in mind about data quality. Who collects it, for which purpose, how detailed the data are, how often they are updated. These are all important questions to consider. Undercount. We know that because of this, how the data are collected, some groups are often undercounted. One of the most obvious groups is the people who are unauthorized, and for a variety of reasons, they might choose not to participate in the survey, or when they participate in the survey, they provide incorrect information, which affects the quality of the data. And so since we talked a lot about the American Community Survey, estimates suggest that about 10% of the unauthorized population in the United States is undercounted in the data. But that share could be much higher in smaller communities, in new communities for immigrants, in remote communities such as farm communities. So that's something also to keep in mind for people who work and try to work with local level data. American Community Survey and many other government sources are self-reported. So that also affects the quality, because if people feel that they don't want to report how much income they make, or they don't want to report their legal status, there is no way for a survey researchers to assess how good the individual answer is. There are methodologies that were developed to kind of figure out the error associated with that, and but it's not a perfect. The data are not perfect. And then also the survey data that we might be using might not be detailed enough. We might not know the full languages, all languages that people speak. For instance, the Census Bureau reports that at least 350 languages are spoken in the U.S. homes, but when you look at the data that we have access to, we have at most 100 to 130 languages to work with. And again, for most purposes, that's sufficient. But if someone is working with a small community with new immigrants in those communities, they might miss the important language because the data are not detailed enough. And also changes over time. The definitions change. How data are collected might be different from time to time. So when we look at the data across a span of time, a span of years, it's important to understand, especially if you see big jumps up and down, it's important to understand whether these jumps are real or whether there was something with the how the data are collected or defined that affects the results that we see. So let's quickly look at the decennial Census and American Community Survey that we often use as the main data source for our work when we want to understand the size, the geographic distribution, and the characteristics of immigrants and their children. So there are three major ways to access data. American Fact Finder has a lot of pre-tabulated tables that will get you some quick information at the state, county, congressional district, metro area, city, and some other geographical levels. The other two, I provided the links so you can look at them a little bit later. The other two require a bit more of experience. I would highly recommend to look at IPOM's online analysis that would allow you to create at least some customized tables, not as full as the use of microdata that Mark mentioned earlier, the POMS data, but at least some online analysis is possible. And to know what is covered by the survey that you are trying to assess, you always want to look at the survey questionnaire. And on the bottom, I provided the link to the ACS questionnaire. One point I'd like to make here is that you should expect to spend significant amount of time in learning how to navigate, access, and understand the data that you are trying to work with. So arm yourself with coffee, tea, hot chocolate, or whatever makes you happy, because there are lots of data out there, and with more data, it's getting more confusing of who offers what and how good the data are. So again, don't be discouraged by a lot of data. You just need to expect to spend some time on that. So the next two slides, I might skip, but they show how, if you go to American Fact Finder to find information about children from immigrant families at various geographical levels. And you'll see very quickly, hold on, let me see if I can point here. You will do the selections by using the menus on the left, right here, on the topics, geographies, and so on and so forth. You can do a search for a term. I did a search on nativity, and that gave me all the tables that contain information about on people's characteristics by their nativity. And important, I would encourage you as you work more with American Fact Finder, is to remember or write down the table numbers, because it's much easier to look for the table numbers later on than to find them based on the name. So if you do this, and again, please play with that a little bit later and see if you can replicate the table. What you will get a table like this, which shows the parental and own nativity of children of immigrants in United States, Maryland, and Montgomery County, Maryland, for comparison. The yellow parts are the populations that will fall into the definition of children of immigrants. And you can also, by clicking over here, you can generate right away a table for these various years. So once I added the numbers in yellow and calculated the percentages, I find that of all children of immigrants in the United States account for 25%, in Maryland for 28%, and double that number in Montgomery County. So very quickly, you can find this information for your geographic location. The Department of Homeland Security publishes data about arrivals. So how many people arrived to the United States in various legal statuses per year, whereas the Census Bureau data will collect information about people who currently live in the United States. So think about it as stock data, how many people live in the U.S. in a given year, that's the Census Bureau data, and the flow data, arrival data from the Department of Homeland Security. So again, I provided the links to the data sources about that, where you will find data on legal permanent residents, on arriving refugees, on naturalized citizens, and some of these data have age breakdowns. So again, I showed you the tables here because it might be difficult to find them otherwise. A lot of people were interested in the unauthorized population, so the DACA population. USCIS recently updated the applications numbers, but also provided some population characteristics, which was not done before, and everything is now located on this one website rather than you needing to go to different websites. And on the number of unauthorized, DHS does publish number of characteristics, but the data were from fiscal year 2012, which is quite outdated. I'll suggest you where you will get the more updated data later. It also publishes data on apprehensions, so unaccompanied elderly children, family units over time. You will find the data right here. Office of Refugee Resettlement is in charge of resettling refugees. So they produce data that is very up to date, like nearly to today, or maybe yesterday. So that's a great a source for refugee arrival data. Again, expect to spend some time, but using these the admissions and arrivals data, you can find the age and gender breakdown of refugees by country of origin. So we did recently a small report about refugees from Syria, and we used these data to show the proportion of Syrian refugees who are women and children, and it's a very high proportion. We're talking about 70 or so %. So this is where you can get from here. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is also in charge of providing care for UACs, and that's why this is the source for the for UAC data. You'll find data by age, country of origin, gender, length of stay, and importantly, how many UACs were released to sponsors by state and county. If you're interested in understanding the characteristics and outcomes of children from immigrant families in K through 12 population, a lot of data are available from the Department of Education, both on the characteristics and outcomes. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the data are not collected by nativity or parental nativity, but rather by English language status. So when you look and look at the Department of Ed, either national or state, at the national or state levels, for the most part, the data are only available by ELL status. And then, so these are the government level data, but there are other data providers. And the reason why there are other data providers is that for the most part, these research organizations, they provide their own research. They do their own research, and for that they need to use the federal and other survey data. But we also recognized that we want to make it easier for others to use available data. So MPI, PRV, and kids count, we serve as aggregates of one-stop shop for information about either immigrants or about children of immigrants. So you don't have to go through various data sources looking for the data that are available. You come to a place like Kids Count, where there will be lots of data on children of immigrants organized by state, and you can even see the data over time. And it's a great resource, especially if you are starting out. MPI, through the Migration Data Hub, we publish a lot of data about immigrants, immigration, trends over time, geographic distribution, and so on and so forth. And PRV, with its data finder, I think that Mark alluded to what kind of data you will be able to find more, but already there are some data on socioeconomic characteristics and numbers that you will be able to find. Other good data providers are Pew, Urban Institute, Center for Migration Studies, and you will find that they for the most part, these organizations use officially reported data, but also we, when the data are not available, for instance, on the unauthorized numbers and estimates, we use demographic and statistical methods to develop such estimates or to make them, to offer them at a more granular level, such as state, county, metropolitan area, congressional district. And so if you're interested in the county and state information, you will come to NPI Data Hub. If you're interested in the congressional district or metropolitan area, the Center for Migration Study will have some data. So again, familiarize yourself with these various data sources, and we also serve as a resource for the field. So if you have questions, feel free to email me, and if we don't have the data, at least I can point you to the data source that is out there. So I wanted, I don't think I have time to go over the next few slides in detail, but I just thought that for children of immigrants, I wanted to show you the 3 data sources and what they show and what kind of data you can get from each of them here, and it's the same for the unauthorized children. So just click there when you have time and let us know if you have any questions. Someone asked about recent research about immigrants and their impact on the U.S. society. So MPI has done a lot of research that focuses on immigrants' integration and their outcomes. But I wanted to point out 2 fairly recent reports from the National Academies of Sciences that look at the research literature from the past 20 years about immigrant integration outcomes, and as well as about the fiscal and economic impacts of immigrants that are very important to have as context for when we talk about the trends and the impacts. I'm going to stop here, and so we can leave some time for Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Jana. Laura Spear had a question. Her question was, does DHS produce any estimates on apprehensions of unauthorized parents of children under age 18?
So the thing is that the DHS collects data on people it apprehends, but what they release to the public and to researchers is much limited from what they collect. What people often do, they file a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request, and after some time, the DHS will release the information given the criteria that you specify. But as far as publicly available data that are out there, I don't think it's available, except that in one place, and that is, hold on a sec, let me show you. It's right here, apprehensions of family units. That shows how many family units, so families who were apprehended, so you have to have at least one child and one parent to qualify for the family unit. So that perhaps might be the best proxy right now. But to have more detailed data, you would have to FOIA the data from DHS.
Great, thank you. And then there was one question that was more for the Arizona organization, but I'm wondering if either you or Mark know what's behind the decline in the immigration population in Arizona from 2000, if you have any insight on that. And if not, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume that it's linked to the crackdown on unauthorized immigration in Arizona. I don't have any hard data on that, but I would think that that's certainly a factor.
So while Mark was giving his presentation, I quickly took a look at the MPI's website to see whether the change in the children of immigrant population might have to do with the slowing number of immigrants, slower growth in immigrant population in Arizona. And that's certainly the case. If you look at the change between 2000 and 2010, the population grew much faster than it grew between 2010 and 2015. So because you have fewer immigrant families, the number of children born to fewer immigrant families will be also lower. So the number of children of immigrants did not grow as fast as it used to be. In terms of the reasons for that, I think Mark is exactly on the point. Arizona has been leading the anti-immigrant movement with a number of state and local legislations that affected how many immigrant families chose to stay in Arizona, as well as how many people decided to move to Arizona.
Great, thank you. And I don't see any more questions, but I wanted everyone on the webinar to know that PRB and MPI are working on updating a document that they developed probably 10 or so years ago that outlines all of the data and data sources that are available for children and immigrant families. And that'll be available sometime later this year. And maybe we can have a webinar to let you all know about that resource once it comes out. But if there aren't any more questions, or Mark or Shauna, do you have any final comments?
I'll just note that we're a little behind schedule, so I don't know that we'll have that document by December, but it'll be available, if not in December, then early in the new year. And it'll be, it's updating the original report was called Data Matters, Immigrant Data Matters, and so we're updating that. It's going to include all of the resources that are available, not just for kids and immigrant families, but for people of all age groups.
Thank you.
of all age groups at different statuses. So we'll have information on foreign students, on outcomes, educational and labor market outcomes. And the other thing is that we will have a data source update and expand the data sources from the U.S. as well as the international, because a lot of the data that we have now and a lot of the questions that we have now about immigrants and their children are relevant for other countries. So we'll have the kind of data that offer the comparative perspective.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jana and Mark. It was really informative, and I believe that it'll be useful for all of us. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.